Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'll go ahead and call the K-12 Higher Ed CIP Joint Subcommittee to order. Meeting has been duly posted and access to the meeting has been put on the agenda. And by now, I think folks have figured out how to access our meetings. We have presentation this morning on education. So with that, if we could go ahead and begin with the Department of Education. I believe we have a PowerPoint to go through, and we'll ask questions along the way at the different budget items. So good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Madam Chair. Great to be here with all of you this morning. Committee members, for the record, my name is Joan Ebert. I'm the State Superintendent of Public Instruction. I think you've seen this slide before, but I would like to reemphasize that our values are driven here with equity, and especially with all of you this morning, not only inclusive of access to quality, success, and inclusivity, but transparency, making sure that everyone in the public is aware of where public funds are going and how they are used. With that, our visions, we have our goals that we worked with the entire state.
Ms. Ebert, if I could stop you for a moment. I was in such a hurry to get going, I forgot to call the roll. So that happens to each one of us who chairs every once in a while. So if I could go ahead and have our committee staff call the roll. I know you're all here, but I think we need to know it for the record.
Nice. Senator Canizaro.
Here.
Senator Dondero.
Here.
Senator Kiefer.
Here.
Senator Ratty.
Here.
Senator Severs Janser.
Here.
Assemblywoman Benitez Thompson.
Here.
Assemblyman Frierson.
Here.
Assemblywoman Gorlow.
Here.
Assemblyman Hafen.
Here.
Assemblywoman Haddahey.
Here.
Assemblyman Levitt.
Here.
Assemblyman Roberts.
Here.
Everyone's here.
I'm sorry, I believe mine froze for a moment. Are we good?
Yes, everyone is here.
Thank you very much. And committee and presenters, I've been having some technical issues this morning. So if something happens, if Senator Dondero would step in just in case, I don't want to slow you down, but for some reason, we're having some issues here this morning. So with that, Ms. Ebert, I apologize. If you would go ahead and proceed.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Superintendent Ebert. This morning, I am joined by Deputy Superintendent Hartz, Deputy Superintendent Dr. Jonathan Moore, as well as Deputy Superintendent Gonzalez. They oversee, with the work of the entire department, the items that are addressed in our goals. And I know today we are hitting hard the very first two, which are all children birth through third grade have access to quality early child care and education, and all students have access to effective educators. With that, during this hearing, you have asked us to address 5 budget accounts today. They're listed on slide 5. And so with that, Madam Chair, I believe just for clarity that we will introduce each and review each of these budgets, and then we will pause for your questions, answer them before moving on to the next budget.
That would be great. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. With that, Deputy Hartz will take over and start with budget account 2620, instruction in financial literacy.
Good morning, members of the subcommittee. For the record, my name is Heidi Hartz, and I serve as the Deputy Superintendent for Business and Support Services at the Nevada Department of Education. Slide 6 does provide an overview of Budget Account 2620, Instruction in Financial Literacy. Through this budget account, we provide funding targeting financial literacy, specifically topics that are identified in NRS 389.074. That would include ensuring that students have the skills necessary to develop financial responsibility, to manage their finances, to understand the use of credit, to understand the basic principles of savings, to prevent and limit consequences related to identity theft, and then to understand the basic assessment of taxes, the principles of insurance, and to plan for higher education and career choices. In the current biennium, funding was allocated for financial literacy instruction as prescribed in Section 48 of Senate Bill 555, which was the K-12 funding bill. Allocations were made to Clark County School District in the amount of $500,000 per fiscal year, to Washoe County School District in the amount of $150,000 per year, and then to rural school districts and charter schools in a total of $100,000 per year. I would note that in fiscal year 2020, a total of 5 rural school districts received funding, and in fiscal year 2021, 4 rural school districts have received funding. Similarly, in fiscal year 2020, 4 charter schools received funding, and in fiscal year 21, 1 charter school was selected for funding. Each school district and charter school proposes how to best invest the funds that they have received specific to this purpose. This slide identifies some of the ways that school districts and charter schools have expended these funds. Would range from professional development and curriculum development to providing online programs and courses for students, as well as obtaining books, materials, and printing, and planning activities for Literacy Month, including parental engagement in those activities. The governor has recommended that during the upcoming biennium, as part of the transition to the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan, that the funding in this budget account be transferred into the State Education Funding Account, Budget Account 2609. This is reflected in Decision Unit E 949. This recommendation is based on the fact that many of the funds that are invested in financial literacy instruction target the students. As I mentioned on the previous slide, many school districts and charter schools are investing funds in books, materials, supporting documents, and activities related to Literacy Month. Slide 10 is a summary slide that we have provided for each budget account that has transfers recommended to the State Education Funding Account. So this slide just demonstrates that it is recommended that funding for financial literacy would be transferred into the State Education Funding Account, and there would be no funding remaining in this budget account as we start the next biennium. Madam Chair, we'd be happy to answer questions on this budget account at this time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hartz. So with that, I believe I'll go to Ms. Howdigy.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And I just a couple of questions, and you touched on this a little bit about not having any money as we start the new fiscal year, but I saw in fiscal year 2020, and I think I know the answer to this, but fiscal year 2020, it looked like there was almost $270,000 left over in the financial literacy account, and looks like it was pretty much all expended in fiscal year 2021. You guys are working on expending the remaining $270,000, and if you are, could you walk us through what you're going to use those dollars for?
Heidi Hartz for the record. So while we allocated all available funds in fiscal year 2020, not all school districts and charter schools expended all of those funds. So they did balance forward into fiscal year 2021. The department is currently working with school districts and charter schools to identify how those funds can continue to be invested to support our efforts around instruction for financial literacy. We do believe that all funds will be obligated within this fiscal year.
Okay, perfect. And you would be able to give us an update on what those funds were expended or what they are planned for once plan is ready?
Heidi Hartz, for the record, the department can do one or both of two things. We can certainly provide your staff with copy of the subgrant agreements for the current fiscal year so they can see what is budgeted. We can also assist them in obtaining information at the close of the fiscal year so that they can see what was expended and then share that back with you, understanding that expenses will not be fully processed until we get to the state fiscal year end, which will be in September.
Thank you, Ms. Hart. And then what are the anticipated changes to the program if the program funding is transferred to the state education funding account?
Heidi Hartz, for the record. As is the case with all of the programs that are being recommended for transfer to the state education funding account and allocated through the pupil-centered funding plan. The funding would be allocated through the statewide base per pupil funding amount and the corresponding adjusted base per pupil funding amount for each school district. The statutory provisions that pertain to the importance and the instruction of financial literacy will remain in place in statute. Therefore, school districts and charter schools will still be expected to provide these opportunities and educational services to their students. So the only thing that will change is the manner in which the funding is distributed to school districts and charter schools.
Thank you, Ms. Hart and Madam Chair. That answered my second question, but if I could just to follow up.
Go ahead.
Since no funding is going to be recommended for the instruction in financial literacy, and I know we touched on it being in statute, but will there be legislation to eliminate it from statute?
Heidi Hartz, for the record. At this point in time, I am not aware of any pending legislation that would remove the provisions in statute specific to the provision of instruction in financial literacy from existing statute.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Howdiggy. I have Mr. Levitt next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is more of a logistic thing. So I'm in favor of, financial literacy instruction. I just wondered if you had some sort of benchmark or gauge or data to see the effectiveness, to see what the return on investment of this funding was. Are you guys tracking it in any way?
Heidi Hartz, for the record. The department has a monitoring tool in place to track the instruction that is provided. The department also has a seal in financial literacy that is available to students, which documents their having received this instruction.
Are you good, Mr. Levitt?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair.
You're very welcome. Ms. Gorlow?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just had a quick question regarding the classes. You mentioned how many schools were performing the classes, but you didn't mention how many students were receiving the education. So do you by chance have that number available?
Heidi Hartz, for the record. The standards target all students who are to be receiving instruction in financial literacy, and that spans from grade 3 through grade 12. While not every school district or every charter school receive grant funding specifically for this purpose, the standards of instructions are applicable to all schools.
So does that mean that all schools do have some sort of a financial literacy program?
Heidi Hartz, for the record. There's no requirement that schools have a specific program. The requirement is that they offer or include this instruction as part of their regular instructional activities and processes. Again, instruction is to occur from grades 3 through grade 12, and the instruction would need to be age appropriate.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions from other committee members at this time? Not seeing anyone or hearing anyone wishing to be recognized. I believe we can go ahead and move on to the next budget account, please.
Thank you. For the record, Heidi Hartz. The next budget account is budget account 2618, the Professional Development Programs account. This account includes funding for the statewide Council for the Coordination of Regional Training Programs, the Regional Professional Development Programs, which are often referred to as RPDP, as well as funding for the Great Teaching and Leading Fund and the Peer Assistance and Review Program. I would note that during the 2019 legislative session, Assembly Bill 309 redirected funding for the current biennium for the Great Teaching and Leading Fund and the Peer Assistance Review Program to block grants that were targeted towards each school district. The governor's recommended budget restores these amounts in the base budget for the upcoming biennium. The governor's recommended budget does include a decision unit E688, which would reduce the funding for the Great Teaching and Leading Fund program by $744,000 in each year of the upcoming biennium. AB 309 had previously redirected approximately $4.9 million of funding each year to the AB 309 block grants. When the restoration of the AB 309 block grant funding is taken into consideration with the proposed budget reduction, there will still be approximately $4.2 million available for allocation in each year of the upcoming biennium. I would note that the State Board of Education does establish priorities for this funding on an annual basis, and statute requires that they identify these priorities on or before September 30th. And that concludes the decision units in this budget account.
Okay. Thank you. With that, I believe Speaker Frierson has some questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I certainly don't want to necessarily take up all the time on this particular budget, but since AB 309 is front and center on it, I thought I would at least get started. In reviewing my notes and my recollection from last session, there were general fund appropriations from the whole biennium between the Great Teacher and Leading Fund and the Peer Assistance and Review Program that were transferred into the School Remediation Trust Fund to implement AB 309. Now, obviously, AB 309 was intended to be a transition, a bridge, kind of a one opportunity to make sure that we were able to at least consider transitioning into a pupil-centered funding formula. So my first question is really more about the mechanics of how it worked. So could you explain how AB 309 affected the use of the funds for those two particular programs, the Great Teaching and Leading Fund and the Peer Assistance and Review Program? Could you discuss how AB 309 affected the use of those funds throughout the school districts and charters during FY20?
Heidi Hartz for the record. The block grant funds that were allocated through the passage of AB 309 were awarded to the school districts shortly after July 1st of 2019. The school districts and charter school authority then did provide a report back to the director of the Legislative Council Bureau in November of 2020, identifying specifically how they expended those funds. We would expect a similar report in November of 2021, identifying how school districts expended those funds in the current fiscal year. With respect to the impact that redirecting funds for the Great Teaching and Leading Fund and the Peer Assistance Review Program to the AB 309 block grants, the impact on those programs specifically was that they had less funding to award during the current biennium. With specific reference to the Great Teaching and Leading Funds, the department was in the process of subgranting the available funds in the spring of 2020. However, before the subgrants were finalized, We had received a request from the governor asking us to begin identifying budget reduction options in light of the economic crisis that was facing the state due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Because these subgrants had not been awarded, we put those on hold in case those funds were needed to help the state achieve its budget reduction targets.
Actually, if I may, Madam Chair, and I may bounce around a little bit, but that kind of was a segue into another question I had about the putting that on hold for the Great Teaching and Leading Fund for FY21. Since there is a balance, from what I recall, we'd approved a reversion from the Great Teaching Leading Fund to the general fund, but there's also a balance of over $200,000. So is there a plan for the unexpended part of that $208,000?
Heidi Hartz for the record. Yes, the department is currently working to identify how to allocate the funds that do remain available for distribution in fiscal year 2021.
And is that something that you could get to our folks, our staff, as we approach closing budgets and looking at this stuff? Everybody who knows me knows my spreadsheets make my eyes cross a little bit, but if we're trying to close it out, do you have any idea when we would know what the plan would be for that unexpended part?
Heidi Hartz for the record. I'd be happy to follow up with your staff to provide them an update of where we are. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I backing up a little bit, with respect to the categorical programs that were within AB 309, is it a clear delineation of which program allocated, the most funding? Which of those got allocated the most of those categoricals?
Heidi Hartz for the record. I believe LCB staff actually provided that information to the department following the end of the 2019 legislative session. Do you want me to review that list now or?
No. Well, if my folks provided it to you, then I'll ask my folks. And I assume that means that you all don't disagree with the numbers then that our folks provided.
Heidi Hartz for the record. When we received the information from the LCB Fiscal Analysis Division, that then allowed us to better understand where the funds were being transferred from to support the block grants, and we move forward.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. It's not the first time I asked somebody a question that I had the answer to somewhere else. So thank you for your patience, Ms. Hartz. My last question, at least for now, is, with all of these transfers away for AB 309 and then AB 309 phasing out, could you address why the Great Teaching and Leading Fund and the Peer Assistance Review Program is not recommended to be transferred into the new state education funding account in order to support the PCFP?
Heidi Hartz for the record. As the Department of Education and the Commission on School Funding worked to identify what funds should be allocated through the Pupil-Centered funding plan, we looked at the intended use of the funding. And if funding targeted the provision of professional developments or salary adjustments for educators or other incentives, then we left those funds outside of the allocation for pupil-centered funding, because districts and teachers would receive those funds in different amounts based on the number of eligible teachers. So the Great Teaching and Leading Fund is intended to provide high quality professional development, leadership development, and also to increase the teacher pipeline. So those are very teacher focused services and also help to build capacity within the workforce. Similarly, the Peer Assistance Review Program uses funding to provide peer-to-peer observation, coaching, and mentoring for ongoing support for just newly hired teachers, as well as more experienced teachers who are looking to further improve their skills. The funding can also provide supplies such as instructional or classroom management and support additional professional development opportunities, again, for teachers who would benefit from that.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And thank you, Speaker, very much. I think there's one that I need to go back to that you sort of opened the door to. We know the different programs that we put into 309. And the idea in my mind behind 309 was to be able to allow these funds to be used by the different school districts and be allocated in such a way that would benefit them the most. So I guess what my question is which one of those funds that we put into 309 ended up being allocated out all the way, and which ones were of the most use to the districts and which ones weren't?
Heidi Hartz for the record. In essence, the funding that was allocated through 309 block grants was swept from other programs in order to allow that funding to become available. So when we issued the block grants, we simply issued payment for a block grant. We did not identify which portion of the block grant came from which program of origin.
Then I guess I need to make my question a little clearer then, Ms. Hartz. So when they asked for the money from the block grant, do we know what they were allocating it to?
Heidi
We're
Hartz.
trying to get to which money was of the highest and best use, which program was accessed the most.
Heidi Hartz for the record. Thank you for clarifying your question. The school districts and the state public charter school provided their annual report in November back to the Legislative Council Bureau, identifying how they invested those dollars in the purposes that were allowable for the block grant. The department was not responsible for receiving those reports. What I do recall from those that were shared with us is that the investment strategy was unique to each school district. Again, I'm happy to work with your staff if they don't have copies of all of those reports or if they need assistance in analyzing those reports to better address.
And thank you, Ms. Hartz. I think you've made your point. We appreciate it. We're just trying to get information from everyone here on the committee when we've done something new as in AB 309. We're just trying to get a feel for what portion of it was the most benefit. It's just a simple question. So you've referred us to a report twice. We'll pull up that report and we'll go through it from there. So thank you very much. So committee members, are there any other questions on this particular item?
Madam Chair.
Senator, go ahead, please.
Oh, so I think you were calling me.
Yes, Senator,
Okay.
go ahead.
Answer. Yeah, thank you. So I guess maybe we need to get that report. I was just wondering, the RPDP programs, the training programs, if they're surveyed on a regular basis to see how effective they would be, get the teacher's opinion, and then maybe even the principals and other, maybe the district's opinion on the different programs that they are deploying, because I think they're extremely valuable, but it'd be nice to get some feedback to measure how effective they are. And maybe that's in a report as well. Thank you.
Superintendent Ebert for the record. Thank you, Senator. The RPDPs are required to submit an annual report, and they have submitted those on time, and we're more than happy to provide you with those. They do survey, specifically to your question, they do survey the teachers that they provide those supports to. That is included in the report, their satisfaction. In reviewing those reports this last year, the teachers were extremely satisfied, as you noted, in receiving professional development, learning. Financial literacy was brought up earlier. RPDP did provide supports. And I would also like to note that they have been extremely beneficial in coordinating with us during this pandemic as we have shifted to distance learning.
Thank you. And are those reports on your website?
They are on the individual websites for RPDP. I know they are submitted to us. I do not, that is one of the things we're working on in SB 76 to bring better alignment with the State Department of Education and the RPDPs. Right now, there is not alignment with the State Department of Education and the work that they do.
Thank you. So I'll look for those, and if I'm not unable to find them, I'll reach out to your office to try to figure out where they are. Thank you.
Committee members, are there any other questions? Hearing none, I think so committee members, the report that was referred to earlier was an actual report that was provided by the school districts to us. So Ms. Kaufman, I'm sure we'll be able to have a conversation about that at another time. Committee members, I'm sorry for the confusion, if there was any confusion on that. But the report actually on 309 comes from these school districts, and I believe it goes to the department, and the department forwarded it to us. So I think that's where it's getting a little disjointed. So we'll address it at another time and make sure that everyone has the correct information. I'm just not used to being referred back to a report when we ask a question. So, but we'll find it and we'll get the answers for everyone. Are there any other questions from any other committee members at this time on this issue? Seeing none, if we could go ahead and go to 2673, please.
Heidi Hartz for the record. The next budget account on today's agenda is budget account 2673, the Office of the Superintendent. And this budget account supports the administrative costs of the superintendent and her leadership staff in the performance of our duties. The governor's recommended budget includes a decision unit E225, which totals approximately $286,000 in fiscal year 22 and approximately $289,000 in fiscal year 2023 to continue the support of two positions dedicated to the implementation of Senate Bill 543, more specifically the implementation of the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan, and to support travel costs for the Commission on School Funding based on their anticipation and desire to return to in-person meetings as soon as it is safe to do so. I would note that in the current biennium, these costs were paid using an allocation to the Interim Finance Committee Contingency Fund on behalf of the Department of Education. Slide 15 summarizes the duties for each of the two positions that are currently available to the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan, an Administrative Services Officer and a Management Analyst position. Moving forward, the Administrative Services Officer position will continue to document the business rules that pertain to building the budget and running the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan model to allocate available revenues in each year of the biennium. Keeping in mind that as we continue to review and update the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan, that revisions will be needed on an ongoing basis. Additionally, there are components of the model that require a biennial update. That would include adjustments for things like the district size adjustment and the Nevada Cost of Education Index. Additionally, recommendations can be made by the Commission on School Funding, the Department of Education, and other partners that would impact the model and require that it be updated. The position is also envisioned to help with development of the biennial budget preparation, specifically for budget account 2609, the state education funding account, and then to monitor revenues received in each year of the biennium, tracking that the revenues are received in alignment with the legislatively approved budget. A management analyst position will continue to document business rules that pertain to the various reporting requirements included in Senate Bill 543, as well as the processes that are used for tracking enrollment data that is included in the budget development process. The management analyst position will continue to review laws and regulations specific to education and the funding formula, as well as tracking the end funding balances for school districts to determine if transfers are necessary from each school district to the education stabilization account. The position will track enrollment projections for total enrollment for each upcoming biennium, as well as the anticipated enrollment numbers for the weighted categories of services, and to support the Commission on School Funding in their meetings and activities, as well as their reports. The Commission on School Funding has ongoing responsibilities, which are specifically identified in Section 11 of Senate Bill 543. Slide 16 summarizes, those responsibilities, which includes the ongoing monitoring of the implementation and providing recommendations to the Legislative Committee on Education to improve implementation of the pupil-centered funding plan, or to address deficiencies that may be identified within the Department of Education or school districts, and to revise any laws or regulations regarding education. The Commission on School Funding also has a responsibility to provide recommendations to achieve optimal funding within the state of Nevada. They may also recommend the addition or elimination of weighted categories, and they do provide biennial review of the various cost factors included in the pupil-centered funding plan. So in addition to reviewing the Nevada Cost of Education Index and the district size adjustment, the Commission would also review the statewide base per pupil funding amount, as well as the adjusted base per pupil funding amount and the weights for each of the weighted categories. I would note that the Commission on School Funding has been meeting since September of 2019. Initially, their meetings were 2-day meetings each month. Beginning in July of 2020, their meetings became a 1-day per month meeting. And starting in February of 2021, they have returned to 2-day meetings so that they can best conduct their business. The next decision unit in this budget account is Decision Unit E275, which recommends the restoration of in-state travel totaling $12,000 in each year of the biennium. This enhancement restores a funding reduction that was approved during the 31st special session, and the funding is intended to support the superintendent and staff as they fulfill their requirements to serve the students and teachers of the state. I would note that NRS 385.180 does indicate that the superintendent or her designee shall visit each county at least once each school year. And I would note that the superintendent and other staff in her office also provide in-person support to meetings, events, as well as staff who are located in other duty stations than where the positions themselves may be housed. With that, Madam Chair, we'd be happy to answer questions with respect to Budget Account 2673.
Thank you. I believe Senator Don Darrow Loop had a couple of questions.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you for that overview. Can you just kind of give us an overview of what the anticipated workload associated with the pupil-centered funding plan? You know, what are the requiring ongoing services of the administrative officer position and the management analyst position in the upcoming biennium? If you can just give us a short kind of description of those jobs.
Heidi Hartz for the record. As we noted on slide 15, the duties of these positions will be ongoing. We don't anticipate any change in their workload. We believe that they will continue to be asked by the Commission on School Funding, for example, to model different scenarios or situations. We may also receive similar requests from the Governor's Finance Office. The Administrative Services Officer will play a critical role as we move forward with implementation, not only in ensuring that we implement the model with fidelity, but also in tracking the revenues that are being received. so we can ensure that those revenues are being received in alignment with the legislatively approved budget. This position will also be critical in making any changes that may be recommended by the Commission on School Funding, the Department of Education, or the governor as we prepare for the next legislative session and the next biennial budget. The management analyst position will be heavily focused on working with the school districts to ensure successful implementation and adherence with the various reporting requirements that are included in Senate Bill 543 for both school districts and individual schools. This position will also be dedicating a large portion of time to tracking the end funding balances for school districts and ensuring that any funds that are to be transferred to the education stabilization account are transferred within the timeframes allowed within statute. Keeping in mind that Senate Bill 543 indicates that school districts with an ending fund balance greater than 16.6%, or whatever their percentage of ending fund balance was in fiscal year 2020, anything over that amount would be transferred to the education stabilization account beginning with the end of fiscal year 2022. And then enrollment projections are also something that this position would be responsible for identifying and preparing as we move into the next legislative session, ensuring that we are capturing the data in a consistent format and that it is readily available for each step of the budget building and approval process.
Thank you. That was, you actually answered my next question within that one, so thank you for that information. And was there some, and I'm based on your answer, but I'll ask this. So was there some analysis that the department did to determine if existing positions could be repurposed or reassigned to assist with that implementation of that pupil-centered funding plan? I know that there's been numerous changes that have been implemented, so I'm just clarifying that for all of us.
Heidi Hartz for the record. Yes, the department did do analysis to identify what our staffing needs are, recognizing that with the implementation of the pupil-centered funding plan and the ongoing review process that was included in Senate Bill 543, that we do continue to need additional staff. We hope that these two positions will help us to support that work.
Thank you. And then just another couple questions on the Commission on School Funding. So the challenge, can you describe what the challenges are with conducting those meetings virtually and why that commission might be unable to continue conducting those meetings virtually in the next biennium?
Heidi Hartz for the record. The Commission on School Funding has really struggled to have meetings virtually. There are, I think, just conversations that they feel more confident having in an in-person setting. And they've also expressed concern that while we do hold our public meetings over the internet and the public has an opportunity to participate, there's always concern if members of the public are getting the full benefit of that opportunity. I think all of us who are participating in meetings virtually can recognize that there is a benefit to a virtual meeting, but there are also some disadvantages to that face-to-face contact.
True that. And then would you just kind of add on to that why the meetings, the monthly 2-day meetings will be needed in the future in the next biennium?
Heidi Hartz for the record. Our experience thus far has been that the work is sufficient to necessitate a 2-day meeting. They're often held on a Thursday afternoon and continue on to Friday. Certainly, if the Commission on School Funding feels that a 1-day meeting would be appropriate, then the department would support that. But we also appreciate that in much of the last 18 months, their preference has been a 1.5-day or a 2-day meeting, which they felt was necessary for them to conduct their business.
Thank you.
Ebert, for the record, I would expand on Deputy Hart's response in that the work of the commission now has really shifted to the optimal funding for our state, and not only what revenue sources to consistently to stabilize education funding in our state, but also the definition and what our outcomes of our students, what an optimal education system looks like. And so that is very deep work that I'm thankful that the 11-member commission have all raised their hands to do, and we work hand in glove in moving this forward.
Thank you kindly for those, for indulging me in those questions and your answers. Thank you very much.
Committee members, any other questions at this time? I do have a couple of others, but I think I'm going to go ahead and take those offline so that I can get a little bit deeper answers. So if there's no other questions from any committee members on this one, then we can go ahead and move on to the next item.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Heidi Hartz. The next budget account is budget account 2709, the Office of Early Learning and Development. This budget account includes the funding that is intended to improve access and the quality of early childhood education programs, targeting students or children from birth to grade 3. I wanted to begin this presentation by providing a quick overview of the funding methodology that was used during the current biennium. At the close of the 2019 legislative session, it was recommended that funding for fiscal year 2020 be based on the actual expenditures incurred by subrecipients in fiscal year 2019, less any one-time costs, such as classroom coaches and improvements. And then the reduction or elimination of costs that had been identified as disallowable, which would include transportation to and from school and indirect costs for subrecipients. While NDE attempted to honor this methodology, we found it to be very difficult because the school districts and other subrecipients were eager to receive their funding allocation and seat counts in July and August so that they could ensure that they had hired appropriate staff and they knew how many students that they could enroll. Our challenge was that actual expenditure incurred data would not be available until August or September after the fiscal year had closed. NDE revised the funding methodology, which was shared with LCB staff and shared with the Interim Finance Committee through an informational item in August of 2019. Just as a quick review, the department ultimately developed a distribution percentage that was used to allocate funds to each school district or subrecipient. That allocation percentage was applied to the amount of general fund available in fiscal year 2020. And then we reached out to each subrecipient to see if they would continue to accept the seats that they had previously been funded for based on the revised funding methodology. As we move through the process, we did have some seats that were declined. We had some subrecipients who indicated that they could not fill all the seats or they could not afford to fill this, to participate at that time. The declined seats were then offered to subrecipients, but the funding that corresponded to those seats were based on the original allocation of funding, not necessarily the seat cost or funding that was being received by a specific subrecipient. So as an example, if subrecipient A had 5 seats that they were not going to accept and each seat had a value of $1,000, those seats were offered to subrecipient B, who had the opportunity to accept or decline those seats at $1,000 apiece. Although subrecipient B may have already been receiving, for example, $1,500 per seat. Each subrecipient had to make a decision both based on their anticipated enrollment and their ability to fully fund the seats, regardless of the amount of funding available from the state. The Department of Education's goal was to maintain the same number of seats in each county if possible. when comparing the available seats in fiscal year 20 to what was available in fiscal year 19. After all current seats had been allocated, the department then allocated the 48 seats that were newly funded during the 2019 legislative session. I would note that the department did experience some challenges as we tried to reassign seats. As I mentioned, not all seats are funded in the same fashion, and so it was difficult for some subrecipients to identify if they could afford to take a seat for which less funding was available. We also experienced some concerns with inequity because we had seats being funded through multiple subrecipients in a single county, but those seats were being paid for at different amounts of funding. Ultimately, 5 seats were never reassigned within fiscal year 2020. The next slide should provide some graphics. The table on the left shows the type of funding that has historically been used to fund pre-K seats, as well as the enrollment numbers. The pie chart on the top right of this slide shows the braided funding that total approximately $6 million per year that's needed to ensure we have sufficient funding to serve all of the 3,000 students who are eligible for pre-K services through the state pre-K program. The pie chart on the lower right shows how the funding is allocated for salary costs as well as operating costs. I would note that the state funded $19.7 million covers primarily the salary and benefit costs for the staff. That would include 1 teacher and 1 aide in each classroom, and leaves approximately 7% of funds available to cover operating costs such as supplies. The governor's recommended budget includes a modification to the funding allocation process. As recommended, seats would be funded at a consistent amount of $8,410 each. This amount represents the average seat cost that was calculated when state general fund revenues for pre-K were taken in combination with braided funding identified by subrecipients and divided by the number of seats that were intended to be funded by the 2019 legislature, which was 3,071 seats. This revised methodology creates a predictable amount of funding for each seat. It eliminates reliance on braided funding. Many of our subrecipients have shared that it's becoming increasingly more difficult to secure braided funding for pre-K programs. And I would also note that with the implementation of the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan, funds previously allocated through Zoom and Victory for pre-K will now be allocated through the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan and target students in grades K through 12, not in pre-K. The revised methodology also supports efficiency in the allocation methodology because all seats will be funded at the same amount. And it supports the ease of reallocating seats if necessary because all of the seats will be funded in a similar fashion. The base budget includes funding for pre-K seats totaling $13.5 million in each year of the biennium. Based on an average seat cost of $8,410, this would fund 1,607 pre-K seats. Decision Unit E275 restores funding for pre-K, totaling approximately $6 million in each year of the upcoming biennium, and this restores funding that was previously reduced during the 31st special session. Based on a stable seat cost of $8,410, this would restore approximately 740 additional seats. The governor, the governor's office, and the Department of Education have also put forward to the Interim Finance Committee a work program that would propose to allocate approximately $1.8 million of gear funding in fiscal year 22 that would offset the braided funding that would not be available for pre-K seats that was previously paid for using Zoom and Victory funds. If this work program is approved, this would support an additional 217 seats. When the base budget, the restoration, and the possible approval of the work program are taken into consideration, there would be approximately $22 million available for pre-K seats in the upcoming biennium, and that would allow us to fund approximately 2,560 seats in each fiscal year. The next decision unit in this budget account is Decision Unit E276, which recommends the revision of the funding allocation for 2 positions, specifically the Education Programs Director and the Administrative Assistant. This would result in a general fund expenditure of approximately $91,000 in fiscal year 2022 and approximately $93,000 in fiscal year 2023. This recommendation is intended to allow the department from avoiding future audit findings. These positions are currently funded 100% through a federal grant administered by the Welfare Division. However, the staff duties are not limited solely to the work funded through that federal grant. As we continue to work with the Welfare Division, they are very thorough and consistent in their monitoring, and they have expressed concern with the allocation of the funding for these positions versus the time and effort. And so we've been strongly encouraged to be proactive to address the audit finding before it is actually levied. With that, we'd be happy to answer questions about budget account 2709.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hart. So this one has always been kind of complicated when we talk about the braided funding because we use Zoom, Victory, Title I, Special Ed, Head Start funding in order to be able to put all the funding together. And if I remember correctly, it was basically so that the half-day slots for pre-K would become full-day seats for pre-K. Is that correct?
Heidi Hartz, for the record, that is correct. The braided funding was used to help us transition seats that had originally been funded as a part-day class or part-day seat into a full-day seat.
Okay. So I guess one of the concerns that I have is with just this baseline funding, and I understand where you're trying to come from, but with this static funding and without braiding the funds, what do we anticipate the consequences of this might be? Because there are programs that will benefit from this because their amount is actually lower, and there are programs that are higher. And did we take into account or have any discussion about some of those programs possibly going back to half day and not offering a full day seat because the funding will not be at a level that could sustain the full day seat?
Heidi Hartz, for the record, statute currently prescribes that pre-K services are provided on a full day basis, a minimum of 25 hours per week. So school districts or other subrecipients would not have the opportunity to provide anything less than the 25 hours per week.
Superintendent Ebert, for the record, you're hitting the nail on the head with what we have all been struggling with for the last biennium. We actually asked West Ed to help us with that exact question. And so they came in and helped us. We worked with our community constituents as well. And how do we create that environment of stable funding to make sure that our students are served? And working through this process, those exact questions were asked that you're asking us now. And this is our best thinking of how to stabilize across our entire state. So we can now identify and clearly articulate when there are funds, additional funds made available for pre-K. We know that exact cost. It also is the intent that those funds, and we've had lots of conversations with the school districts and the state public charter school authority, that the funds that they have been using for PK will still be used for PK. This is not an intent to provide less seats, but to stabilize the seats that we have within the funding that has been made available, the 19 million. And then as you note on the slide prior, there is the additional funds that have been provided to grade and create those additional seats. Thank you.
Okay, in looking at some of the breakdowns across the state, there is a varied number on what it actually takes to do pre-K. And I believe if we take on the public policy of providing pre-K, then it should be equitable across the board. And I'm just concerned what'll end up happening is with that statutory provision, there'll be less seats available rather than more seats. Especially in areas where I believe they're really needed. Now, when it comes to the two nonprofits that are allowed to provide this education model, would they be able to use other funding to supplement this?
Superintendent Ebert, for the record, those entities do not have access, like school districts have access to title funds, the special education funds, as you noted earlier, unless they wrote grants themselves and sought additional funds either through grants or through philanthropy, they would not be able to have additional funds.
So in some cases, the school districts may be able to help absorb some of the cost and be able to make sure that those seats are still available to families that need them. But when it comes to the private providers that are doing education, they don't have the same opportunities to be able to absorb that. I've always had a lot of questions about allowing a private entity to do this, especially when they're allowed to take almost 20% in cost off the top. That's fewer children being able to access the actual seats. I just have concerns that with this flat amount, we're going to have fewer children sitting in these seats. So if we could go back to the gear funding, I believe that's going to come up at the next IFC meeting. And I missed part of the comment, Ms. Hartz. I think I froze up and didn't quite hear it all. Could you go back and repeat that for me, please?
Heidi Hartz, for the record, I'd be happy to. The Department of Education has put forward a work program, which we hope will come to the Interim Finance Committee at your April 1st meeting, that seeks approval to allocate $1.8 million of GEAR funds for fiscal year 2022 to cover the Zoom and Victory funds that have previously been used to braid pre-K seats and would not necessarily be available as we transition to the pupil-centered funding plan. While the provision of services under Zoom and Victory continues with the implementation of Senate Bill 543, the funds that are allocated through the pupil-centered funding plan target K through 12 students, not pre-K students.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I guess my own, I'll open it up to other members, but I believe as we move forward towards this pupil-centered funding plan and then the public policy of supporting pre-K, I know we went with the nonprofits at the beginning to make sure that there was access to enough children, but I believe as we move forward, these programs need to come back into the school districts and education should be provided by the school district. This is not daycare. This is pre-K. This is education. So I hope we can eventually move towards that, to where we have kids actually being educated through the school district and not through a nonprofit. I believe Ms. Howdigi had a question, and then Ms. Benitez Thompson, I'm not sure if your question's been answered or not, but I'll go to you after Ms. Howdigi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I do have a couple of questions, if that's okay. And it's just, again, it being the first time on my committee, I just want to make sure I'm fully understanding the budget. I had some questions just to follow up on the chair's questions when it came to the nonprofits. I was looking at some of the costs, the operating and utility expenses, and the personnel costs for community services agencies and United Way of Southern Nevada. And community services agency seems to be getting significantly less. They're getting about $313,000 in this budget, and United Way is getting about $4.3 million. And I don't know if this is a question you can answer, not being part of these agencies, but why is the personnel cost the same? And why is the operating and utility expenses so much more for community services than it is for United Way?
Heidi Hartz for the record. I don't have those sub-grant agreements in front of me, but it would seem reasonable to presume that the operating costs for each entity may vary based on the size of their facility or the infrastructure that they already have. As a comparison, all businesses and all even state agencies, we incur different costs based on the sizes of our facilities and the services that we have available for janitorial, for maintenance, those types of things.
Okay, and I mean, can you speak to the personnel costs? Because I'm assuming if the budget is, almost $4 million less, I would assume the personnel costs would be equivalent, like it would be less, not more. And the personnel cost for community services agency is more than United Way.
Thank you for the question, Jonathan Moore for the record. One of the unique aspects of operation for the child care centers is that they support working families, which often means that they are open beyond the 5 hours of pre-K services. And so what that does in child care centers, unlike school districts, is that once the 5 hours of instruction concludes, they continue to support the child, potentially while parents are working on their full work day. And so that's why there would be some variance in the cost, particularly an increase across child care centers.
Madam Chair, and if I can, I just have one more question on this decision unit and then one on E276.
Go ahead, thanks.
Okay, and then I just want to go back to the average per seat cost for fiscal year 2020 and then the average per seat costs, projected for fiscal year 2021. I noticed that and I know why the average per seat cost went up, but I was wondering, why did the average per seat cost go up instead of the allocations going down? So, for example, I'm going to use Great Basin College. They had an original allocation of about $235,000 with 24 seats and an average per seat cost of $9,857. But I'm assuming because of COVID-19 in fiscal year 2021, they only had 13 seats and the allocation stayed the same, which means that the cost per seat went up to $18,198. So why didn't we just reduce the allocation instead of increasing the cost per seat?
Heidi Hartz for the record. I believe that one of the governor's emergency directives indicated that in an effort to continue to provide support to our youngest children, that services could continue to be provided without a reduction in funding. And we did experience declines in enrollment in our pre-K programs throughout the state due to COVID-19. And then also some subrecipients reported that they saw a further decline in enrollment as families learned that providing virtual instruction to 4-year-olds for 5 hours a day can be rather tedious, and that was not something that they could sustain or support on an ongoing basis.
So then that money was expended, and you guys expended, using Great Basin College again, $18,000 per seat. that money was used. You spent $18,000 per seat for 13 seats.
Heidi Hartz for the record. The amounts that we allocated would be what we authorized in our subgrant agreements for each fiscal year. We would not know what's been expended until we approach the end of the fiscal year and we have that financial data from each subrecipient.
Thank you, Ms. Hartz. Okay, and then my last question was on E276. You talked a little bit about the on-site monitoring, but can you give me more details on what recommendations came out of that on-site monitoring, and then what actions you've been taken, and then what would be the ramifications if these two positions aren't approved?
Heidi Hartz for the record. The Welfare Division began monitoring our subgrant agreement with them back in the summer of 2019. And so they've identified concerns that we have been working to address. And I believe we have been successful in addressing all of them. One of the concerns, for an example, was our ability from the Department of Education to submit timely requests for reimbursement to the Welfare Division. The Department of Education administers several grants and contracts on behalf of the Welfare Division as part of our subgrant agreement. We request our subrecipients and contractors submit their requests for reimbursement by the 15th of each month. The Welfare Division requests that the department submit their requests for reimbursement by the 10th of each month. So we've been working to identify how we can address some of those delays that are just the result of different agencies having different business practices in place. As I said, I think we've addressed all of the concerns that were identified from that first monitoring visit back from 2019. But something that we identified and are aware of is the concern with the allocation of funding for these two positions. And so we were trying to be proactive with bringing this to the attention of the governor's finance office and the governor's office, and now to all of you.
And so I guess just to answer that second part of my question, what would be the ramifications if the funding positions, if the positions weren't approved? You don't feel that you would be able to meet the recommendations that come from the on-site monitoring?
Oh, Heidi Hartz for the record. If this decision unit were not approved, the department would have to determine how best to provide oversight and management to our pre-K program, understanding that if federal funding is the only funding source for our program director, then 100% of her time must be solely focused on just that subgrant agreement and the work that is included in it. It would certainly hamper our efforts to allow her to manage this program and to best meet the needs of the children of our state.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Howdigi. Senator Kiekeffer, did you have a question?
I do. Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. Ms. Hartz, I was hoping you could clarify on the issue of the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan. Does that statute actually prohibit the use of money out of the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan for anything for pre-K?
Heidi Hartz for the record. There is nothing in Senate Bill 543 that says funding cannot be used to support pre-K services. However, the funding that would be allocated through the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan to support English language learners and students who are at risk would receive Zoom and Victory services. There would be no additional funding remaining to provide pre-K services to other students, other children.
Would it have then made sense to maybe deduct the amount that we're spending from Zoom and Victory to support pre-K for those targeted students into this program so that it could continue to support pre-K for those students?
Heidi Hartz for the record. That is an option and certainly something that was considered as we contemplated how to move forward with the implementation of the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan. One of the challenges in doing that is that not every school district is allocating funds similarly for pre-K services from what was previously Zoom and Victory funding. And similarly, any money that we carve out of the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan to designate for other programs and services would in turn reduce the amount of funding available for the statewide base per pupil funding amount, and then in turn the weighted funding for the three categories of students included in the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan.
So your solution of using GEAR funds to help address that gap is really just a one-year solution, right? So we'll have an increase, we'll have a seat drop off in the second year of the biennium.
Heidi Hartz, for the record, I did mention the work program that is coming, and in fact, that is only for fiscal year. It would allow us to obligate those funds to be expended in fiscal year 2022. The Department of Education is also working with the governor's office and the governor's finance office to see if it would be possible to do a budget amendment to include gear funding in fiscal year 2023 for the same purpose.
Thank you. I want to make sure I understand how the funding is allocated. So when you distribute the funds for pre-K to the sub-recipients, primarily the school districts, is it going to be on a per seat basis, or is it going to be on a dollar value basis? And then are there consequences for those districts if the cost of providing that service is more than the allocated funding?
Heidi Hartz, for the record, the intent would be to continue to allocate funding on a per seat basis to each school district and subrecipient moving into the next biennium.
So if you allocate, for example, the Carson City School District, 96 seats, right, at the fixed value of $8,410 being $803,480 for each fiscal year. But they can only provide 75 seats based on that allocation. What happens?
Heidi Hartz, for the record, the intent is that if a school district, as you have described, indicates that they can only accommodate a certain number of seats, then the seats would be redirected to other school districts or subrecipients. Again, our first goal is to try to maintain the same number of seats in each county as has been previously funded.
And then get back, I mean, at that point, the downward pressure just is in a spiral, right? If they can't provide it for that much, then they can't provide it for that much. So, I mean, I think it gets back to Madam Chair's point about whether this is going to sufficiently provide the opportunity to ensure kids have seats across the state. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator. Ms. Beninas-Thompson, did you still have a question or was it answered?
It was yourself and Senator Keykeeper were kind of in the same line. I still feel kind of, I think, left confused about a couple of things, but I'll kind of just marinate more on it. I guess the one question that I was left with is, so prior to the legislature funding the pre-K seats, districts or even kind of specifically just schools would prioritize pre-K based on availability and funding and kind of make it happen here or there. And then you saw it happen mostly in just Title I schools where they could use some of those funds. So I guess I'm just left unsure, and this is just a basic question. So right now with the seats that we're funding, do those represent 100% of the state pre-K seats, or our state funding just represents 50% of the seats that are out there, or 70% of the seats that are out there?
Thank you for the question, Jonathan Moore, for the record. So as part of our current conversation, these seats that we're currently describing, approximately 3,000 in the corresponding funds, represent state pre-K. What we do know is that there are school districts who are providing pre-K programs outside of state pre-K, and they are leveraging additional funds at their discretion to be able to implement those programs.
Thank you. And if you could just let me know, I was just trying to get an idea of what the state funded portion looks like of the entire composite of pre-K states. And so I guess that's a number. I just wasn't sure where we were on that. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. This is Jonathan Moore for the record. So we would estimate that for those additional pre-K programs that are being offered, that it represents about $10 million additional dollars.
Any follow-up, Ms. Benitez Thompson? I don't believe so. Okay.
No, Madam Chair, thank you.
Thank you. Committee members, are there any other questions on this particular budget? I think after everyone has time to think about it, we're all going to have a few more questions, I'm sure. Okay. With that, I believe we can go ahead and move on to budget account 2712, please.
Thank you. For the record, Heidi Hartz. The next budget account on today's agenda is budget account 2712, student and school supports. This budget account includes the distribution of federal funds, more specifically title funds, that are intended to provide support for students and schools who are deemed to be at risk, students who live in poverty, migrants, Native Americans, and English learners. The governor's recommended budget includes Decision Unit E-225, which requests one new education program's professional position specifically to manage the Title IV grant. This position would be funded using federal Title IV administrative funds and is anticipated to cost approximately $89.7 thousand in fiscal year 22 and approximately $98,000 in fiscal year 2023. This position would administer and monitor funding required by the federal grant and would replace a temporary employee that the department has had the benefit of utilizing in the current biennium. The position would be responsible for providing recommendations for approval or revision to local education agencies' proposals or applications for the Title IV-A grant, as well as to approve requests for reimbursement for expenditures incurred for that federal grant. The position would monitor compliance and the effectiveness of programs and propose evidence-based interventions to ensure our schools are successful in serving their students. The position would also help with conducting risk assessment levels for each LEA, and then create documents or instruments to evaluate the effectiveness of the programming and prepare and submitting reports required by the U.S. Department of Education. As I noted, the Department of Education has had the benefit of a temporary contract employee. The goal behind requesting a state position funded with federal funds is that this would allow us to ensure that administrative funds specifically for the Title IV-A grant are be expended for that purpose, and to allow us hopefully to have some more consistency in our staffing levels. Oftentimes when we hire temporary employees, as soon as they find employment, such as in a state position, we are left with the need to find another temporary employee. Slide 26 includes Decision Unit E-275 and E-276. E-275 recommends the restoration of funding for grants administered by the Commission on Mentoring, totaling $25,000 in each year of the upcoming biennium. These funds were previously reduced during the 31st special session. Decision Unit E-276 restores funding for external evaluations, totaling $165,000 in fiscal year 2023 only. And again, these funds were previously reduced during the 31st special session. The department would note that currently we do have funding for specific programs to be evaluated externally, and that would include Zoom and Victory, the social worker grant, Read by Grade 3, Nevada Ready 21 technology grants, underperforming or turnaround schools, the Great Teaching and Leading Fund, and the new Nevada Education Funding Plan. With the implementation of the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan and the shift from Zoom schools and Victory schools to services for students who are English learners or who may be at risk. We believe that external evaluation will be very important so that we can continue to assess and monitor the programs and services that are available to each student and to confirm that we're seeing positive results, much like we did with the school-based services. The external evaluation for Read by Grade 3 would not necessarily be focused on the funding allocated through Read by Grade 3, but would be focused on our efforts to ensure that our students are compliant with the requirements in statute so that they're reading on grade level by Grade 3. Similarly, with the restoration of funds for the Great Teaching and Leading Fund, external evaluation will be very helpful in measuring the ongoing success of these programs and services. I would note that funding is currently only available in the odd numbered fiscal year so that we can evaluate the even numbered fiscal year and provide that information to LCB staff and in turn to yourselves in anticipation of each legislative session. Within this budget account, we do have one federal grant that is anticipated to expire during the upcoming biennium. That's the Indian Education Grant, and so that has been identified in Decision Unit E490. That grant will expire on December 31st of 2021. And with that, Madam Chair, we'd be happy to answer questions regarding budget account 2712.
Okay, I'll go to Senator Ratty to begin, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Hartz, for that explanation. I think you touched on some of this, but I'd like to dig into it just a little bit further, particularly the evaluations. So I think you'll find strong agreement from the committee that evaluations are important, that we want to know if we're being effective. And I think we acknowledge that we're in this period of transition between the two funding models. I guess my question is it looks like in the budget that there's continued recommended funding for external evaluations for programs that are set to expire on the 21st. And so just functionally, if there's money in the budget for doing evaluations on categorical programs that don't exist, that will cease to exist, are we still really doing evaluations on those programs, or are we shifting our evaluations to the weighted funding formula and what really is the department's intent on sort of the scheduling of evaluations over the next biennium?
Heidi Hartz for the record. As we shift to the pupil-centered funding plan and the allocation of funds through the statewide base per pupil funding amount rather than specific state-funded grant programs, we still want to evaluate the programs and services that are identified and required to be provided to our students in statute. Although the funding mechanism is changing, the statutory provisions are not changing. And it's very important that we continue to evaluate that the programs and services are not negatively impacted in any way, simply because the funding is being allocated using a different methodology and a different process.
So I just want to make sure that I'm clear on the facts here, not advocating one way or another. Are the evaluations still required in statute following the end of June 2021?
Heidi Hartz for the record, I am not aware of any proposed changes to the evaluations that are currently required in statute.
Okay. And again, just same line of thought, it looks like there's a request for the funding to conduct the external evaluation for the underperforming schools program, but I believe that program is recommended for elimination. So what would that funding actually be spent on?
Heidi Hartz for the record. I know this was discussed during the 2019 session. I've come across some information as I've reviewed documents, but the department would appreciate some flexibility in identifying how much funding is available for evaluations, and certainly understanding that the underperforming schools is not currently recommended for funding in the upcoming biennium. We would like to repurpose those funds to help us perhaps do a more in-depth evaluation, or appreciate that an evaluation of a program like, or services like Zoom and Victory may be cost us a different amount of money moving forward because we're looking at services provided to students rather than services provided through specific schools.
Right. So perhaps what would be helpful, not in this moment, but maybe you could get us a list of how you sort of envision the timing and sequencing of evaluations as we make it through the transition, because I do think it's critically important to all of us that we know that we're evaluating the right things, but it's a little hard to picture in the transition what we would be evaluating when, as we're contemplating moving. I understand we're still looking for the outcomes, but what it is exactly that we're evaluating to achieve those outcomes, I think it would be really helpful to see that. It would help me, I'll speak for myself, to see the sequencing of how you picture evaluations moving forward. And then just shifting a little bit, you just talk a little bit more about the education programs professional and the improvements you can see to the administration of the program.
Heidi Hartz for the record. So as I indicated previously, the program has indicated that they are often, while very appreciative of temporary contract employees, they tend to have more turnover in those temporary positions than we would normally experience in a full-time state position. And so the request is to establish a full-time state position funded with federal dollars so that we can ensure we have ongoing capacity, but also continuity in our staffing model. It would also allow the department to potentially capitalize on subject matter expertise that may be developed or achieved. It's been my observation that many times the Department of Education is fortunate to hire individuals who previously worked in a public school, and they bring with them a wealth of knowledge and experience. People who work in the public sector are often seeking employment in the public sector. This would allow us to begin to offer employment opportunities for folks in that position. It's often difficult to get people who are currently public sector employees to leave those jobs to take a contracted position or a temporary position.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Senator, very much. And just to go back to clarify, I do believe the statutes that address the evaluations do expire June of 2021. If I could ask someone on staff to confirm that, please. I believe that's what I have on my list.
I'm sorry,
Yes.
Madam Chair, for the record, this is Sarah Kaufman. Yes, you are correct. Senate Bill 543 repealed NRS 387.139, which relates to these.
And thank you, Ms. Kaufman. So I guess the question of evaluations going forward after the statute expires is another issue that we're going to have to address as we move forward through this process. So with that, I believe Senator Dondero-Loop had a question. Oh, and also Senator Severs-Gansert. I see you. I'll get to you next. Thank you, Senator Dondero-Loop.
Thank you. So with regards to the Nevada Commission on Mentoring, how will that funding be utilized and distributed?
Heidi Hartz for the record. The Department of Education will work with the Commission on Mentoring to determine the best way to allocate those funds. And those funds are intended to provide grants that would support mentorship opportunities for vulnerable students, including students who are experiencing homelessness, students who are in neglected or delinquent situations, students in poverty, and students in other marginalized groups. Certainly understanding and appreciating that research shows that those robust student mentoring experiences significantly improve student outcomes.
Thank you very much for that answer.
Okay. With that, Senator Severs-Gansert, and I apologize for not seeing you. I was watching the the Teams chat for questions. So.
Thank you,
Senator-
Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. And you know, I haven't been able to get Teams up, so I'm going to figure out how to do that. So now I understand how to better communicate with you. I've been using my little raise my hand. So I'm kind of circling back because we keep talking about Zoom Victory and Read by Third and a little bit of the pre-K funding too. And when it all gets lumped into the pupil-centered funding plan, we're concerned about accountability. I was wondering if we could get a table that basically has how much Zoom, Victory, and Read by Three funds are there, or would there be this biennium if they did not get rolled into the pupil-centered funding plan? And I guess I'm just concerned that's when I've heard from school districts is they don't know how they're going to be able to afford to continue some of these programs or emulate them, even though it's required for them to do that if all the money gets lumped together. And we know that in theory, it should work, but it sounds like some of the accountability measures are going away. We finally have some success, right? So we learned a couple of weeks earlier that our fourth graders are now at peer reading levels based on the NAEPS test. And I don't think we've ever had that. I think actually our note said that we've never had that before. So we've actually made progress, and now we're basically kind of throwing all the money into one bucket and then potentially not continuing the accountability measures, and school districts are concerned about where they're going to find the money. So if you wouldn't mind, could we have a table that lets us know basically what all the funding is for, I guess, general funds, and then the breakout for Zoom Victory and the Read by Third? That would be helpful for me. And then specifically what the different accountability measurements are and where they are in statute, so that we can kind of track it all and make sense of it, so that we can make sure that this type of programming continues, because we are actually seeing some success with them. Thank you.
Superintendent Ebert, for the record, we would be more than happy to provide you with that information. I would like to add that because you did reference the Read by Grade 3, that is a program that serves every single school in the state of Nevada. Programs like Zoom and Victory, as you are well aware, they are programs that are school specific. And so the intent, for instance, Zoom, was proof of concept to make sure that providing those additional funds, there was success, and there has been success. That is a school-based program that unfortunately is not, as the pupil-centered funding formula identifies, it is not serving all of our students that speak multiple languages and are attaining English as well. And so that is, as we move forward, I want to make sure that we're keeping all of those concepts in mind, that, you know, those Zoom dollars are for a certain number of schools, and it is not for all of the children that are in those same learning situations. And that's what the pupil-centered funding formula does, is identify the student and meets the student's needs.
I appreciate that clarification. And those were more pilot programs because they didn't cover everyone. So thank you for that information and the information I've requested. I appreciate your efforts on that.
So committee members, are there any other questions on this budget at this time? I don't believe I'm seeing anyone else wishing to be heard. So with that, I believe that takes care.
Chairwoman?
Yes.
And my apologies. On my end, when Superintendent Ebert started to respond, it got very quiet. And I think I might be hearing from other members that the audio got relatively low too. And I don't think I caught some of the response. I hate to ask this, but if I could get just a quick synopsis on what was said, because I didn't hear it.
And I just saw that. Thank you, Ms. Benitez Thompson. So Superintendent Ebert, could you repeat what you had stated just a moment ago? And if you could get a little closer to the microphone or speak up a little bit, that would be helpful. Thank you.
I'd be happy to. Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Superintendent Joan Ebert, we were prior discussing that the Read by Grade 3 program, which you have funded for many sessions, and thank you, is across provided for every single school within our state. That in mind, we know that the Zoom and Victory programs were pilot programs and are only available to those schools that have been identified. The Zoom program specifically was identified for students, our English language learners, back in 2013 with the highest number of ELL students. By maintaining those programs as is, and if we were not to put them into the pupil-centered funding formula, what we see is that we are not providing dollars for students that exist across the entire state in all of those other schools, which almost every single school in our state does have English language learners. And so the intent of the pupil-centered funding is to make sure that every child that is identified with those needs receives those dollars. So I was distinguishing between a program that is provided across the state, such as Read by Grade 3, and then those programs which currently, the categoricals, which currently only serve a few students, not all of the students that are identified with that need.
Thank you so much. I guess I have a clarifying question. The Read by Grade 3 program, I thought that the funding for that was grant funding, that schools could apply for reading specialists, but that was categorical in the fact that there had to be schools applying annually for those additional reading specialist resources.
Thank you for the question, Superintendent Ebert. For the record, prior to the 2019 session, that is correct. During the last legislative session, that shift was made to identify providing those funds directly and not on a competitive basis.
That's right. We did fix that. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Superintendent. Appreciate that. So, committee members, are there any other questions at this time? Not hearing or seeing anyone wishing to be recognized. Thank you very much, Superintendent and Ms. Hartz. We'll do our homework and dig out those reports and try to figure out where those dollars really ended up. So I believe that wraps up our budgets for today. Our next item on our agenda is public comment. So we'll give it just a moment to allow people to queue up for public comment. It's 9:48, so we'll give it a couple minutes, and if the committee would just stand at ease, and then we'll start on our public comment section. Okay, broadcast services. Do we have anyone in the queue for public comment this morning, please?
Chair, this is Michael from Broadcast. We have several people on the line, and I will queue up the first one now. Caller with the last 3 digits, 626. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Good morning, chairs and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Rob Wilson, ROBWILSON, and I'm the Vice President of State Government Affairs of the Nevada Credit Union League. Thank you for the opportunity to offer some brief remarks on item 2620. Nevada credit unions are very passionate about financial literacy, especially among school-age kids in Nevada, and have been very supportive of financial literacy courses being taught in our schools. Far too often, our member credit unions have members that come into them that have gotten themselves into a financial pickle that could have been easily avoided if the individual had been taught the basics of financials. This is why the credit unions of the state have taken upon themselves to offer seminars on financial literacy to their members and to help facilitate learning opportunities in the classrooms for students. The Nevada Credit Union League appreciates the great work this legislature has done in the past on the issue of financial literacy and getting it into the classrooms. We understand these are tough times, but we respectfully ask that the funding be restored to the program. Now more than ever, it is important for the students to learn and understand the basics of finance. Thank you very much.
Caller with the last 3 digits, 149. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin. Caller with the last 3 digits, 149. Please press *6 to unmute. Chair, I'm going to move on to the next caller. We'll try that one again later. Caller with the last 3 digits, 336. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Good morning. For the record, my name is Phyllis Gergovich, PHYLLIS GURGEVICH. I am President and CEO of the Nevada Bankers Association. Thank you, Chair Carlton and committee members for the opportunity to comment on item 2620. The lack of financial know-how is a serious problem throughout the United States and here in Nevada, one that threatens economic stability. Nevada banks and bankers commit thousands of dollars in volunteer hours to be part of the solution. We've been privileged to support Senator Woodhouse's tremendous work in this area over recent years and legislative sessions. Students are fortunate that Nevada has shown a desire and a commitment to support their successful futures by requiring grade appropriate financial literacy coursework throughout the students' school years. This coursework will lay the foundation for students to develop the knowledge, tools, and capabilities needed in order to make informed financial decisions throughout their lives. We are thankful that Nevada continues to recognize the importance of financial literacy instruction for students, and we hope that the committee can find an opportunity to continue to fund these important efforts. Thank you.
Caller with the last 3 digits, 577. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Good morning. Chris Daly, DALY, Nevada State Education Association, the voice of Nevada educators for over 120 years. NSCA's comments on several of the program budgets presented this morning. Regarding budget 2620 on instruction and financial literacy, NSCA is concerned as this program budget is transferred to the state education account, the most important line of accountability between districts and the state is blurred. While the requirement for financial education remains in statute, the impetus for districts to deliver on this legislative priority is watered down. We see this as one of the many unintended consequences of SB 543. NSCA supports restoring funding in budget 2618 for professional development. To ensure high-quality public education, it's necessary to provide our educators, both licensed employees and education support professionals, with appropriate professional development opportunities to gain and improve knowledge and skills important to their positions and job performance. This has become even more important with COVID-19 and the switch to distance education last school year and a renewed emphasis on social and emotional learning. Over the last several years, NSCA has advocated for expanded peer assistance and review across the state, has developed a professional development programming, including micro-credentialing, support for teachers getting their national board certification, as well as expanded training for education support professionals. Budget 2673 includes support for the Commission on School Funding. NSCA remains concerned this important commission excludes the voice of active educators. And finally, on Budget 2709, NSCA supports the maintenance of the number of pre-K seats, but would like to point out that there's still significant unmet need across the state. We agree with Chair Carlton that pre-K programs provided by school districts is preferable to private providers. Another intended consequence of SB 543 is the loss of pre-K funding with the transfer of Zoom and Victory dollars to the state education account. While we appreciate the consideration of GEAR dollars to offset this loss to pre-K, it's important to remember these are one-time dollars and will eventually have to be backfilled by other funding sources in the future. Another possibility for this committee to consider is maintaining existing Zoom and Victory schools and funding, as they do represent Nevada's most successful programs of education equity. Thank you.
Caller with the last 3 digits, 622. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin. Caller 622, you appear to be unmuted on our end. It's possible that your phone is unmuted. If you could try to unmute that so we could hear you.
Julie Houchins, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Julie Houchins, JuliehOuchins. Thank you for allowing me to speak today in support of the pre-K funding for budget item 2709. I'm the Director of Early Education for United Way of Southern Nevada. United Way of Southern Nevada has been one of the largest subgrantees in the state, providing high-quality preschool education to qualifying children and families since the beginning of the Preschool Development Grant in 2015. We currently support the Nevada Ready State Pre-K programs in 18 private child care and Oscillero learning centers in Las Vegas. Through continued pre-K funding, United Way of Southern Nevada has been able to offer over 3,800 tuition scholarships to prepare our youngest learners for kindergarten success. United Way of Southern Nevada is committed to our continued efforts in building child care capacity for families who are trying to return to the workforce and recover from the COVID-19 financial impacts. Over the past 6 years, we have supported 20 private child care centers in Southern Nevada, and with your continued financial support, we plan to adapt our successful preschool programming in partnership with our colleagues at United Way of Northern Nevada and the Sierra. Our goal is to increase access to high-quality education and care for those families in Northern Nevada where the child care desert is so prominent, focusing on centers located in Lyon County and the rural areas. Thank you for your support over the years, and with your continued financial assistance, I look forward to sharing the success stories of our efforts at future meetings. Thank you.
Call with the last 3 digits, 411. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Lindsay Anderson, Lindsay, Anderson on behalf of the Washoe County School District. The Washoe County School District would like to express our support for the standardized seat cost for pre-K that has been recommended by the Department of Education. We appreciate them for recognizing the difficult position we have been in with braided funding. We provide pre-K directly through the district schools with no nonprofit partnership, and the braided funding presented significant administrative challenges. We had pre-K classrooms with different program requirements, like student age and income thresholds, depending on the source of funding. These differences made staffing, compliance, and accountability unnecessarily complex and confusing for schools and families. Moving to the standardized approach is a priority for the Washoe County School District at this level, which we believe will support our existing classrooms. Additionally, accounting for the transition from Zoom into the pupil-centered funding plan is a critical component. We have used Zoom funds to support pre-K at many of our Zoom schools, and we want to continue this effort as we move forward and manage the shift in funding through the new funding formula at the projected level of funds for Washoe. Thank you to Superintendent Ebert and the Department of Education for working with us as partners to best serve our youngest students. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Chair, pardon me. Chair, this is Michael from Broadcast. The public comment line is open and working, but we don't have any more callers at this time.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that. So with that, committee members, I believe our work for this morning has been accomplished. There's still more work to do, I'm sure, but the budgets that we have before us, we are done with. So with that, committee, thank you all very much for your time and attention. This committee meeting is now adjourned.